Afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's wonderful to have so many people joining us, and it's one of the few bright sides of the COVID-19 pandemic is that actually we get to share our seminars with a much wider constituency. So that's it's really great to see so many people joining from other parts of the world. Just a few house rules. Sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Paul Lane. I'm the professor of the Deep History and Archaeology of Africa, and I've been helping organize the first three seminars in the Garrod seminar series, which is the Department of Archaeology's primary seminar series. Just a few house rules. If you can make sure that you turn off your you mute yourself for the presentation. If you have questions, we'd much rather you send them through the chat, either to Laurie, who is hosting the meeting, or to me. But we may call on you for to actually pose your question if time and situations permit. Just to also remind you all that we are going to be recording Beatriz's presentation, and we will be recording the Q&A. If you do not wish your comments to be recorded, then please send your question anonymously via chat. I think on that point, and thank you all very much for waiting. I'm sorry for the delay of the start, but we've also just finalized our first departmental committee meeting of the academic year. And as you can imagine, there was an awful lot to get through in a rather short space of time. So thanks for your patience, everybody from outside. It's a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Beatriz Marin-Aguilera. She is a Renfrew Fellow here in the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, and also a Junior Research Fellow at Churchill College. She studied initially at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, both history and archaeology, with a particular focus on the material culture of colonialism. And her research has her postgraduate research has continued that, straddling and connecting the fields of post-colonial theory, social anthropology, and material culture studies. And I can think of nobody better within our current research community to give us a nice overview of some of the issues relating to enslavement, emancipation, and issues of repatriation. And tonight she'll present on aspects of her research on these topics, with particular reference to Antigua and Barbuda. So Beatriz, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It is a pleasure to talk about a project that I was co-organizing with the Director of National Parks in Antigua, Dr. Reg Murphy, who told me he would do his best to be today with us, at least for the question and answers, for the discussion part of this. But I'm not sure to what extent he will be able or not to join us today. So I just present this as if I would present it with him, because it was basically a common endeavor between the two of us and a team of more researchers, most of them coming from the US. So instead of presenting only the project that we carried out in Antigua, what I will do is that I will present also the current affairs related to slavery on the island, and also basically a bigger picture of how slavery is dealt with on the island. And I obviously will talk also about the quest for reparations in Antigua and Barbuda, that is quite recent as well. So I divided the talk in 4 parts. The first part, I will start with the reparations, not with the archaeological part or the historical part of the talk. Then I will move to the archaeological part. Then I will talk a bit about the British slave profits and how British heritage is still very much into part of the British heritage, obviously. It's very much linked to slavery today. And then I will talk about different initiatives that are being carried out both in Antigua and here in the UK to tackle slavery and the British links with the slave trade. I will start with the quest for reparations that, as I said, is a quite recent thing going on in Antigua. Here you see the Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Antigua and Barbuda in 2011 addressing the General Assembly in the UN, saying that, well, asking especially the UK, but also the US, for reparations. And he was mentioning this because he was saying they are not as economic and social developed because of slavery. And they are still dealing very much with questions of racism, in the, not only in the country, but also in relation to other nations. So he was saying it is only ethical and fair and just that those countries will pay reparations. And this was, as I said, 2011. This, however, started already earlier. Also I think it was in 2016 that finally the School of Law at Harvard decided to put a commemoration plaque in honor of the enslaved people from Antigua that made possible the founding of Harvard Law School, as you can see here on the left. But also other type of institutions, I put there only 2, have decided also to create different type of reparations funds, specifically targeting the descendants of slaves in the US and in general in America. But in 2019, the now Prime Minister Gaston Brown of Antigua again said that it was not enough just to put these kind of plaques in commemoration of slavery and just marking the very long-standing ties with slavery of these kind of institutions, but it was necessary that those countries would create funds for the former colonies that were basically deprived of all their resources and had all the slave labor. So this is more or less the political situation today, and it's basically quite global. I'm quite sure you are all aware of all the situation going on with the colonial status or status of slave owners being thrown by different type of communities, being in the US, being here also in England, promoted also by different type of human rights associations, students, etc. So this is basically a global context for these kind of things. That is not something new, but it's something that has been going on already for a while. And then going a little bit back to the archaeological part of the talk. This is a map of the West Indies, and I deliberately chose to include all the indigenous names instead of the, as the primary ones, instead of the European names, because I think it is also important, even if the talk today is about slavery, it is also very, very important to bear in mind that these islands were inhabited when the Europeans arrived. And it was because of the arrival of the Europeans and because of the very hard conditions, the labor conditions, the slavery conditions that indigenous people suffered, that many, basically millions of Black people were brought to the Caribbean to work on the plantations. But this is something that started first with indigenous communities. And actually, historians have calculated that between 2 and 6 million indigenous people were enslaved only in the Americas. So just for you to have an idea of the global dimensions of slavery. This is a colonial map, drawn by a British officer in the 18th century. And here you can see how they have already divided the whole area. So the islands that are highlighted in yellow, as you can see here, for instance, Cuba, but also the area of Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, or north of South America, Venezuela, here Colombia. They are all Spanish in yellow, together with the Hispaniola and Puerto Rico here. The ones that are pink are British. You can see here Jamaica, and here is the island of Antigua. As you can see, it's very, very small. In fact, it's only about 12 miles across, so it's quite a small island. And this is the area of Barbuda that is today part of the same country. And in blue, you can see the French colonies, like here, for instance, which is Martinique. And this is also a French colony, here another French colony. So there were also Dutch colonies, but in this map, they were not really drawn. This is a map from the British Library about Antigua and the different districts that the British divided the island into. And this is only a close-up for you to have an idea of how many wind miles there were on the island. So as soon as you identify the symbol, which is this one, you can see that they are really everywhere. Everywhere on the island, there are these kind of wind miles. They were all related to sugar plantations on the island. In fact, the landscape of the island changed completely with the establishment of the first sugar plantation, Betty's Hope, of which I will talk very briefly afterwards. And I would like you to focus particularly on a particular type of family, the Codrington family. Here you have 5 of their sugar plantations, but they had far more. They also owned pretty much the whole island of Barbuda themselves. So they were quite an important family on the island, and their wealth was obviously completely related to not only to slave trade, but also to slave labor on the island. We are somehow lucky enough to have graphic documentation from Antigua. This is from the book published in London in 1823, 10 Views in the Island of Antigua. And what the author does is it creates a whole visual archive of how slaves on the island were working. So you can see the first image, how they were planting sugarcane. The second one is in the boiling house, preparing in the production of first sugar crystals and then rum. And then in the picture below, you can see how they were loading the barrels into boats. And obviously all of it was carried out by slaves. So the island of Antigua, contrary to, for instance, the island of Cuba that had far more years of slavery, the island of Antigua had 160 years of slavery, from 1674 till 1834. And this is a picture from the Museum of Antigua and Barbuda of Betty's Hope. This is in the early 20th century, when slavery was already abolished within the British territories, the British Empire, but nevertheless it continued to work. In this case, they were not slaves any longer, but they were working on very, very low wages. And so it was almost as if they would continue to be slaves. In many cases, they could not live on the properties any longer, and so that also added to the expenses of these very high skilled but very low paid workers. This was the first project on the island regarding the British legacy of colonialism and slavery. It was carried out together between my colleague Greg Murphy and Georgia Fox from the State University of California. And what they did is that they started excavating Betty's Hope, the first sugar plantation of the island, also part of the owned by the Codrington family. And what they did is instead of focusing only on rebuilding, which they also did, the windmills, what they did also was basically to focus on the neighborhoods, on the barracks of the slaves. They did so because, as my colleague, and I included a quotation there from him, they did so because they still, in the Caribbean, they still hear a lot about the glory of sugar and the industrial colonial legacy on the island, but they rarely hear about the everyday life of the slaves in this area. And it's not only the case of Antigua, but it's the case of many other Caribbean islands, especially the small ones. So what we know is that there were over 400 slaves at Betty's Hope at one time, and their stories have never been told, and that was the main aim of this project. The other aim was not only to see slaves as victims of a whole situation, but also to see slaves as skillful workers who were able to build these kind of buildings in very hard conditions, and that they were also able to survive British colonialism and slavery. And as I said, they also had agency, to the point that in 1736, there was a conspiracy for a very big slave revolt led by Prince Class, which in the end did not happen, but because the British officers got to know about it beforehand. So what they did basically was to kill Prince Class, who came from Ghana, and who was the leader of this kind of conspiracy. And they not only killed him, but they also killed 87 fellows. So they killed basically 88 slaves in order to finish or to end this conspiracy and to avoid the killing of many British people. The conspiracy apparently wanted to massacre at least 3,800 white British that were living on the island. And the proportion was 1 British per 4 black slaves. So obviously they outnumbered the British. But as I said, it didn't happen, which doesn't mean that there were no revolts, basically that the slaves didn't have agency, or as I was saying beforehand, they didn't have skills. And this is part of a program that my colleague Greg Murphy has put into place also on the island of Antigua, but I will talk about that a little bit later. So this is the project we coordinated together. It was about the largest British fortress on the island of Antigua, built in the 17th century. Is the fortress of Great George Fort. And why these kind of fortresses were built in the island of Antigua? Well, fortresses were built for 2 reasons. The first one is because the French raided the island in 1666. So the British were quite afraid of having more French invasions. So they decided to fortify the sugar plantations and the properties on the island, but building different type of batteries and forts, at least 40 on the island, between 1672 and 1800. And what they also were afraid of is of the indigenous communities, because by the arrival of the British, the indigenous communities were not particularly settled on this island because of the Spaniards that spread them out mostly, but they were mostly settled in Dominica, and they were called the Caribs by the Spaniards, who also said that they were eating humans, which is obviously not true, but that was the way the Spaniards were describing these indigenous communities. And the British were also afraid of them, because what the Kalinagos or Caribs were doing is, in response to the British possession of the islands, they were basically raiding the islands, and they were taking white women and children as captives. So that's another part of the story that is also even less well known in the Caribbean, but that there are already projects going on in order to basically to do more research about this kind of history. So these are some of the plans for the fortifications on Antigua. They are all according to a visit from 1752. And you can see here several of them. This is the Monk's Hill Fort, which is the one that we surveyed and excavated as well. But I would also like you to focus on this here, the battery of Indian Creek, because I will talk about that later on. It was an indigenous site. So as I was saying, Antigua was heavily fortified from the 18th century, from the 17th century onwards, And you can see here a map drawn by one of our team members when we were excavating, Christopher Waters, and it is completely full of fortifications, being major forts, being platforms, being basically batteries. The coast was completely fortified. And these are only some of the sugar plantations, but there were also more. And another property that the British had on the island was also cattle mills. So you can see also several of them here. And as you can see here for the proportions, but I told you already, the island is only about 12 miles across. So it's pretty small as an island. This is the survey that we carried out on the fort. As I said, it is still today one of the largest ones, and it's also the one that is located in a higher position in the hill. This is the team. We were not many, but it didn't take us too much time to survey the fort, only 1 week. We excavated small trenches, so we could not really excavate large on the site, but we could get an idea of what type of material culture was the one being used by both British people, but also by slaves that were protected as part of property as well within the walls of this fortification. These are the results of the survey. As I said, 2015, we discovered this was the map, the historical map that we had from the 18th century, but we discovered far more structures that were uncovered by basically by rainforest vegetation that is very, very dense. And what was also clear for us is that the historical maps were not accurate enough, and that the fort was being used until almost the very end of the colonial period in Antigua. And so there were several constructions, a series of constructions going on until the 20th century that was still in use. And this is only an example of some of the items that we recovered from the excavation. Many of them were earthenware and ceramic in general, coming directly from the UK. And this is because, and it's something that my colleague Rick Murphy also uncovered in the excavations of the English harbour, is that the British were basically clinging to their identity, and they were mostly using British earthenware items instead of accommodating to the Caribbean area. They were also wearing the same type of dress and garments, even though obviously the temperature in the Caribbean is completely different from England. The humidity is also completely different from England, but they didn't want to integrate very well in that sense, because they just wanted to cling to their own identity. And the things that we basically uncovered the most were pipes, most of them kaolin types of pipes, as you can see here for tobacco, but also, which was the first crop introduced in the island, and then sugar was far more profitable, so they decided to have more sugar plantations instead of tobacco. And apart from the pipes, we found a lot were rum bottles. And in that case, they were not only coming they were not only produced within the British Empire, but also in the Dutch colonies and less on the French colonies. I will move now to the connections between Antigua in particular and England. So these are British country houses of slave ownership, and they are all very famous, and they are all either listed by English Heritage, or they are owned by the National Trust. So one of them is Torrington House in Gloucestershire, and this is by the Codrington family, built in the 17th century. And as I was mentioning beforehand, they were quite prominent on the island. I was highlighting precisely the properties that they had, although they obviously had far more. Another one is Grace Court, and was part in the 17th century of the Stapleton baronets. And the third example, but there are many, many others, is Bantry House, that then later in the 19th century became actually a hospital. And the important thing here, or just to contextualize this kind of links between British country houses and slavery, is that under the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, the British state agreed to pay £20 million compensation to slave owners and other beneficiaries of slavery. 42 British country houses only from slave compensation in Antigua. So 42 were only from Antigua, and there were obviously far more coming from basically the slave compensation found from other regions of the Caribbean and the Americas in general. And this is just for you to know, because it is usually very well promoted, this idea that Britain fought for the abolition of slavery, and it is absolutely true. But it is also true that they fought for that not on their own, because slaves were revolting against the British Empire and fighting their way through since the very beginning. Antigua is only one of the cases. But also they set up this kind of abolition act, but they compensated all the slave owners. So it is not, the history is far more complicated than is usually presented. And I put this is a very recent well, not very, but it's a recent publication by English Heritage, 2013. And it's a very good publication if you would like to know a little bit more about the links between slavery and the British country house. And you have all these examples, but you have far more other examples. British country houses were not the only direct consequence of slave money, but also the links between British universities with slavery. So, for instance, Reverend Richard Woodbine was a benefactor, King's College. Christopher Covington as well, the same family, was basically the one who founded All Souls College in Oxford, and also the Covington Library in the college. And only very recently, I think it was actually only last year, that the college and the library decided to put a plaque in commemorations of all those that worked in the slave plantations in the West Indies, mostly in Antigua, but also in other areas of the Lesser Antilles that they had properties. And just to finish, I will talk a bit about the new programs, or how things are moving forward, not only in Antigua, but also here in the UK regarding the slave trade and the consequences for both sides of the Atlantic. So in Antigua now, my colleague Rick Murphy is, together with US universities, is excavating the site of Indian Creek. It's a site that goes from 200 before Christ till the present, and it was an indigenous site. It was first occupied by the Arawak communities that were moving from the area of Venezuela all the way up from the Lesser Antilles until the area of Puerto Rico. And that, according to colonial sources, were wiped out by the Caribs or Carinagos. But we really don't know that. So we still need to do a lot of research about that. And as I said, my colleague Rick Murphy has started already. And he has been also doing that in collaboration with local communities, as he always does. In this case, for instance, one of his assistants was Carlin Balmon, who is now also a very famous model in the Caribbean. So she started doing archaeology because she was very interested about the history of the Carinagos, of who she is also a descendant. And she decided to start this because she couldn't believe the history she was reading about these people, how violent they were, and this idea that they were human eaters, which is not true because basically they were mostly living on vegetarian sources and fish, so nothing to do with cannibalism. And this is just for you to have a reference of what the British decided to build one of the colonial batteries as well. So this is also the area of Indian Creek that was occupied until the arrival of the British, more or less by indigenous communities. Another thing that people are trying in Antigua, they are trying to set up together with Rick Murphy is this kind of trade routes on the island, and they are associating this kind of hiking routes with fortifications. So you can see here the remains of one of these fortifications, and here from the island, sorry, from the beach, you can see it there on top. So that is another thing that they are trying to do, a kind of sustainable tourism in order to promote the economy of the island and to involve full local communities. That it's also a kind of a way of creating new jobs and new opportunities, and to keep the wealth of the island within the island. Another thing that has been quite successful is the declaration of the naval dockyard and the related archaeological sites on Antigua by the UNESCO, and so now it's part of the World Heritage Site. It was declared in 2016, but this is a project that Greg was working on for many, many years beforehand. They also restored the naval dockyard, the British port, basically of the island, one of the most important and safest ports, given all the hurricanes that the island also suffers. So that was a very long project, and it's going quite well. It's getting more tourists, not now, obviously, for obvious reasons during the pandemic. What we did also during my time in Antigua was to set up a program with the help of the Spanish government to restore the Great Fort George that we were excavating, and it was restored by local very skillful laborers. And this is only a press note that they wanted to publish. Another thing that my colleague is now doing, and I think is very important also for the Caribbean, is that they are creating this kind of network of Caribbean fortifications. And the interesting thing is that they are doing that locally, so in the region, and they are putting together not only the Dutch fortifications, but also, for instance, the Spanish fortifications in Puerto Rico, Antigua, and also the French fortifications from the colonial period. So they are creating a network of colonial fortifications, and they were also, as I was mentioning earlier, they are very much interested not only focusing on this kind of colonial heritage, but also putting forward this idea of how skillful Black slaves were in these constructions, because they not only build this kind of fortifications, but also different type of wells that are very necessary on the islands, because many of them don't have rivers. So basically they depend on rain for getting sweet water in order to drink. So all those kind of things, and putting forward this idea of the agency of Black communities and Black descendant communities on the island, it's something that it's bringing together also different type of islands with different type of colonial heritage, but at the same time with very much similar experiences confronting racism and social and economic issues today. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we have the initiative by Cambridge University, the inquiry into historical links to slavery, which is chaired by Professor Martin Millett, and the report will be ready, I think, next year, probably at the end of the year. But let's see with how the pandemic also affects this kind of research. Another thing is, and in this case is led by students, which I think is very interesting, is the Uncomfortable Oxford initiative. And what they do different tours and different events in which they show this kind of colonial heritage that Oxford has, and how Oxford University was linked to slavery via benefactors or alumni that were colonial officers, slave owners, etc. Another initiative, in this case from London University, is they were calling for £100 million of slavery reparation, and they were thinking that all universities in the UK should contribute, or at least all those that had proved links to slavery. And they basically want to use this fund to help minorities today in England to get to university, to get a better education, and of course, slave descendants. And also last year, the University of Glasgow said that they had received up to the equivalent of £198 million in today's money from people who were linked to slavery, to slave trade, basically. In 2018, Bristol estimated as well, the University of Bristol estimated that 85% of the wealth used to establish the university depended on slave labor. So these are all things going on this side of the Atlantic, obviously not enough, but at least there are some movements going on, which is not the case for many other European countries who definitely should follow suit the UK. And as I said, it's not enough, but it's good to know that there are different things going on. And that is all for me by now. So if you have any questions, I hope I can reply them. And I also hope that my colleague, Reg, could join us in the discussion, but I don't know if he was able to. So.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Good, thank you. You've unmuted. I haven't got any immediate questions in the chat, but I'm very happy to take some. If you could just send something into the chat, just I'd like to ask a question, please do so. I just had one immediate thought and question thinking about your presentation is, how challenging do the heritage authorities find it to present a very different history of Antigua and a different form of engagement with the physical heritage on the island, when you have such spectacular places as sort of English Harbour and the Naval Dockyard competing, if you like, for Antigua's own sort of tourism presentation? do they find that there is a kind of tension there, that people will want to be drawn by, if you like, this illustrious British naval history of Antigua and its importance, and the well-preserved naval dockyard there, sort of being, are they, in any sense, do they find any kind of sort of pushback from the tourist abroad or anybody else like that? See where I'm coming on that?
I think the most difficult part for the Antigua National Parks, which is the basically the authority for heritage and nature on the island, was to involve local communities and to create a different narrative in which local communities would feel involved. Because at the beginning they were always pushing back, saying that is British heritage. And has nothing to do with us. It has a history of violence, of blood. We don't want to have anything to do with that because we are the descendants of that massacre and those type of conditions. And what they, especially Rec, what he was trying to do, and this is obviously something that you can only do if you live there and you are there all the time, just to build trust relations with the community and try to focus instead on the other side. So how skillful were these workers, all the skills that they had and that they brought to the construction of these buildings, etc. And that was quite a success. When it comes to the tourist industry, it is not so, for instance, the Nelson Dockyard is very much visited by British and US white tourists, who are the most, I think, common tourists on the island. They also go there just to basically to marry because they have spectacular beaches, obviously, and they don't really see a problem with this kind of heritage per se. I think they might have a little bit more of a problem with the museum that comes more on the history of slavery and how slaves were living. And they have also the historical accounts of how many boats were arriving with how many slaves. And more or less it is calculated that for 20,000 slaves to survive, they needed to bring 150,000 slaves. So I think that is uncomfortable. And I don't know to what extent tourists or white tourists actually visit also the museum, or they just stay outside in the Nelson Dockyard. That is very British. And they have also restaurants serving kind of Caribbean British cuisine. So I don't know to what extent they really confront this kind of past.
Thank you, thank you. I'm seeing I'm getting some questions in the chat here, but I'm going to actually ask Dr. Winston Fulgence, who joins us from the University of West Indies, if he would like to just add a few comments and reactions to your presentation. Winston, are you still there?
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. I was really, really happy to be part of this. And here's why. What you did is groundbreaking for the Caribbean, because the history of slavery is not part of our history, written history in the Caribbean. It is, from my research, I was shocked, coming from the Caribbean, I was shocked to understand that we spent most of our time forgetting slavery. And to see a project that looks at slavery in the Caribbean, foregrounding it as part of the history and marrying the information from Europe and the Caribbean to create a holistic approach. I think it's a beautiful project. I really like what you and Reg are doing. I wish you guys all the best. I hope we can replicate it across the Caribbean, because what's happening is most of the time, I was able to actually look at my work throughout all of what you're doing, from the forgetting of the Amerindians, the forgetting of slavery itself, but the remembering of, for example, Prince Class and his rebellion, which is what most of the Caribbean chooses to remember, not the slavery itself. So the fact that you and Reg are actually foregrounding that and moving from the prehistory, which is what most of the archaeology in the Caribbean is prehistoric. You'd think that nothing happened past that. And for you guys to be marrying that is something I think which is new, and I hope it continues in the Caribbean. So that's part for the deliberate forgetting and the fact that you're giving voice to those people. The other thing too is the way you looked at the heritage, I thought was really, really good. The fact that not good, but sorry, groundbreaking. Most of us had not been looking at it that way before. The fact that you're looking for the voices of the enslaved and indigenous people at the sites that you're looking at. Normally, archaeologists come to the Caribbean and look only for the indigenous people and nothing about the forts. For example, the forts, a lot of the forts in the Caribbean have a very strong connection to slavery, and that is never looked at. So thank you so much for that. And I'm really heartened by this project. I have a question though, and it's something that I have experienced in my research as well. The battle in the Caribbean where heritage packaged for, well, commodified for tourist consumption has to be in some way neglect a lot of the trauma that is in that history. How do you guys actually delineate the two? The commodified heritage for tourist consumption and the actual, and what the people on the ground actually experience and would prefer to, or is that what's happening? I will stop here with a response.
As I was saying to Paul, I think that is something that Greg has worked more on than me, because he's obviously the local person there and he's the expert on the island. But basically what he did, he combined it very, very well in the museum, both histories and how both connected together. For instance, the museum also talks about intermarriage and how it was forbidden, but how nevertheless it happened. And it brings that together with the material culture that he found in his excavations before the restoration of the dockyard. And then he did the same also organizing the exhibition of the National Museum in Antigua. And as I said, the most difficult part was not so much the setting up of the exhibition and just combining this kind of historical evidence with archaeological evidence, but just to make the local population in Antigua to feel somehow proud of that heritage, because it's basically a heritage that, as you were very well saying, is completely linked to slavery and to a trauma. It's a traumatic experience, and most of the population in Antigua, actually, they are descendants from slavery and from slaves. So that was the most difficult part, because most of the people didn't want to engage with this type of heritage. They just prefer to do or just to protect other type of heritage, not the indigenous one though, but just to focus on different type of issues. For instance, they are far more interested in other issues like the carnival, which is also very important in Antigua, and I recommend you all to visit the island to see it, because it's it's fantastic. But they also were focusing on, especially on the tourist industry, but mostly from the naval point of view, because they have the dockyard is still very important in Antigua, and they have many competitions, international competitions of people coming from all over the world in that sense. So they are mostly focused on that, and the difficulty was basically to put people to somehow involve them in that type of heritage, saying it's not only part of a traumatic experience, but also highlighting how skillful those people were and how they survived, nevertheless, all the conditions, and how today they are the inhabitants of the island. So that was the most difficult part.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Winston, for those really important comments. So I've got some more questions here. This one's from Oliver Ansak. So were there moments where the historical record, particularly regarding enslaved peoples and indigenous peoples, was challenged by the material you recovered during the archaeological work?
Well, that was, I didn't mention it, but that was actually quite a difficult task, because most of the British colonial documents are actually in London. They are not in Antigua. So it is quite difficult from people, not only in Antigua, but also in the Caribbean, to access those documents, because they cannot fly. They cannot come to the UK, many of them. And so the access to the documentation was quite tight. Luckily, I was in Europe beforehand, so for me it was easier in that sense, but the documents are not that, so to say, prominent on the island. So it was mostly an archaeological expedition, and it was only then that we consulted some of the documents, but as I said, they were quite scarce. So for instance, the maps of the fortifications, most of them were from the 18th, 19th century, but not really until the 20th century that were in use. And what the documents did say is that the inhabitants of these kind of fortifications were not only British British families, but also slaves, because they were also protected as part of the property of those families. So what we were recovering is not only the everyday life of the British, but also the everyday life of those slaves living in the fortifications.
And I have a related question here from Abigail Moffat, who's asking if you had evidence of the use of British material culture, in other words, the pottery, the pipes, etc., by the enslaved themselves. You mentioned them in the context of British use as a means of clinging to the identity, but did other people use these objects and perhaps change their meaning and value?
Yes, so for instance, when it comes to the tobacco pipes, they were also used by slaves. And in Betty's Hope, where they were digging the slave barracks, they also found many of them. Less so, I think, British earthenware, but they were, for instance, using different type of tools. They were making buttons made out of bone that they were using from the tools that they were having from wood or bone that they were using for the plantations, for instance, and they were then reusing them to create buttons and other type of things that they would use for dressing themselves or for creating different type of instruments, musical instruments. But the pottery that they found was sometimes British, but most of the times was not British, was just the type of pottery that they were making on the island. Thank you.
And another kind of a related one, but pushing it a little bit back, this time from Catherine Namono, who is asking particularly about what the archaeology might have told us about the indigenous inhabitants of the island. And she also asked, again, if you could say a little bit more on how Antigua and British museums are dealing with collections resulting from slavery. And if you see, perhaps if you see there's a difference in terms of approach as to whether museums are in the UK or in the Caribbean.
The first part about indigenous part, it is still a very much recent project. So they are just starting with this. It will be also my, I'm working on that as well, but it will be probably my next project for this, because I obviously will need more funding. So it's, we cannot say much about that for now. But what we can say is that the indigenous sites were actually inhabited almost until the arrival of the, for sure, until the arrival of the Spaniards, and most likely until the arrival of the British, because the island of Antigua was first recorded and documented by Christopher Columbus, sorry. But the Spaniards decided not to colonize the island, precisely because the indigenous communities were, according to the Spaniards, quite violent against them. And so it was only the British who settled the island almost more than a century later. But we still don't know much about this in the particular case of Antigua, but we know far more, for instance, in the case of Cuba or Puerto Rico, and there are many researchers already working on that. Also Montserrat, for instance, excavations by the Brown University in the US. And then regarding the relationship between the Antigua collections and the British museums, I think is quite underdeveloped still. So there is not so much a connection now with the Antigua collections. I also don't know to what extent they have many collections from Antigua in particular. Many of the collections are labeled as being or coming from the West Indies or the Lesser Antilles. So sometimes it's also difficult to know exactly from which island those collections came from. And in the case of the museum, for instance, of Antigua and Barbuda, it is in St. John's, Antigua, and most of the collections they have are from Antigua. They don't have any kind of loan from the UK or anything like that.
Thank you very much. I'm doing exactly what I did last week, which actually misreading some of the questions in chat, in the sense that first question about the indigenous archaeology, the pre-European archaeology, was actually from Tunde Babalola. So apologies to Tunde, and apologies to Catherine also for assigning this question to you, but both useful and interesting questions. We've still got time. Any other people would like to? I can see several of you. So, yep, we have a new one coming in. Thank you. So, Anne Hauer. So, Anne, would you like to just unmute yourself and pose your question? Save me misreading it. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, sorry. Hi, everybody. Thank you. That was so interesting. And I'm speaking as someone who's come across bits and pieces about the Caribbean over the years. I was thinking of Corinne Hoffman's team et al. In Leiden, the Nexus 1492 program. And then here at UEA, we have a load of colleagues who are working on hazard and risk and attitudes to heritage in St. Vincent and Montserrat in particular. And what I learned from them is that past colonial patterns of land use, for instance, had a real impact on how heritage is managed and attitudes to heritage. And I was wondering if in your project with colleagues you had come across differing ways of thinking about the heritage of not so much of different periods, but across different islands in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the specialist on heritage in the island is my colleague Greg, not really me. But I don't think he's here, or at least I cannot see him. So yeah, I would say that when I arrived in Antigua in 2015, he was the only person doing heritage, basically doing everything. He was doing archaeology, heritage, restoration, everything, like multitasking completely. There is no one in Barbuda. He is also doing that. He did himself the whole project for UNESCO. So he's very much, in that sense, quite lonely, if I can just use that expression. And compared to other islands, for instance, there are, I see a completely different pattern between different type of colonial inheritance. For instance, the Spanish colonial places, the former colonial places, like for instance, Cuba or Puerto Rico, they deal with heritage quite differently from Antigua. For instance, in Cuba, the colonial heritage has been protected for a long time already, so it's not something new. Mostly actually funded by the Spanish government for obvious reasons. So they found this kind of Spanish inheritance, but they didn't, for instance, give funding for indigenous sites or something like that. So it's still very colonial in that sense. And in the case of the British Caribbean, I really don't know about other projects in Jamaica. I suppose maybe there are more because it's also a bigger island. And I know there are many archaeological projects going on in Jamaica, but I don't know to what extent they are linking this to heritage. And I know the Leiden project has done so very well, together with with local people, but also with researchers coming from different areas of Latin America, and they have connected very well with local communities. And I think that could be one of the ways forward as a model or as an example for the rest of the islands.
Maybe we could bring Winston back in as somebody who's on the ground there, and there's an issue that he's researched. If you're happy to do that, Winston. He may have, yes.
Yes, the situation in the Anglophone Caribbean, I think, is very similar from, say, St. Kitts all the way down to Trinidad. the preeminence of these forts. So a lot of our heritage, the perception of heritage is built around these forts. And the other issue is protection and the legal status of, we have no antiquities laws in most of the Caribbean islands. In fact, my research a couple of years ago, I was shocked to find that out. Very often antiquities are protected through agreements, gentlemen's agreements. And the fact that researchers from North America and Europe come to the Caribbean to look at these things. So there's this, it's understood that we save these things for specific reasons, but we have no antiquities laws. And very often heritage collides with development. So land tenure patterns from a previous question do actually impact on that. And old colonial laws also impact on it. So that's apart from the whole notion of history and whose history and why history and all these academic questions. But on the ground, the practicality is that we have small spaces, we are small island nations, and the competition, the pressure for development and economic development, if you will, is constant on heritage and heritage management. And because we have no laws, specific laws dealing with that, the battle is sometimes lost. In fact, a lot of my colleagues in the Caribbean are exhausted trying to protect heritage. But the other issue, I think, and for me, the most important issue is the fact that most of these islands are ahistorical. For some reason, history is not taught in many of the schools in the Caribbean. And as a result, the population is not very conscious of heritage. And they only come into the conversation when, say, for example, heritage impacts on, or the other way around, when economic development, a hotel on a very small island is going to impact on a site that is deemed to be of value, archaeological and heritage value. That's when the population comes in. But by then, the critical mass is already lost because the society has not even understood the importance of heritage. So it's a mishmash across the Caribbean, and it's a battle that is constantly being fought, especially now that we need to find ways of employing people. And for a lot of the Caribbean, tourism and mass tourism, I should say, has been the choice for economic development. It always impacts on heritage. And the commodification of those sites as well. The forts which you speak of, very often the battle comes around these forts because of the edifices which speak loud in a landscape that is bare of any other signs of historic development. So it's a constant battle, academic and economic. And I think because we are all such small island states, it's going to continue.
Thank you, Winston. And you know, this is something that we've obviously, he and I have discussed at different times with respect to St. Lucia. And I think his comments lead directly into, you know, make a nice link, I think, to Rebecca Roberts' question to Beatriz was, do you have plans to package your research for schools who have just recently been told by the Department of Ed, so schools here in the UK or in Antigua and Barbuda, you know, but those in the UK have been recently told by the Department of Education to avoid teaching victim narratives with regard to colonialism. So, you know, I wonder whether you could talk to that issue that Rebecca raises.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think is definitely very appropriate. So I would very much like to work with schools, not only in the Caribbean, and not only in British Caribbean, the former British Caribbean, but also the former Spanish Caribbean, because I feel that is the only way of bringing different narratives that are not, I was going to say not colonial narratives, but sometimes I don't know to what extent we can really build this type of narratives. I think in the end, we just need to co-create different narratives with the local community and just listen to them as Reg was doing in Antigua. But I think the work is very important. I think in the UK, there is so much to be done, especially dealing with colonialism and teaching colonialism in school, teaching slavery and the legacies of slavery in the UK, and just emphasizing that it's not something from the past, but it's actually something very much from the present, with very important consequences today. And it's not only about overthrown statues, but it's something that is structural and that then is linked to racism and discrimination in general. So I think that there is a lot to do. I would like to, of course, contribute, and I will hopefully do so during my next project. REC is already doing that in Antigua, and I know that there are many other people working on that as well. For instance, the Leiden project was working on that already in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So I think there are many initiatives going on, and I think we just need to continue, and the more the local community is involved, obviously the better.
Thank you. Are there more questions people would like to ask? I'm not seeing you do shout. Okay, I think everybody seems quite content with what you've had to say, or at least they are digesting it. Nobody else is wildly waving their hand as far as I can see. Unfortunately, Reg doesn't seem to have joined us, which is a pity. It would have been good to have had his views. But it is quite a convenient point to end, because it allows me to flag up next week's seminar, where rather than having a single speaker, we are having a roundtable discussion on embedding Black history and archaeology in British schools. We have an impressive range of speakers who will just give us perhaps a 5-minute to 10-minute perspective from how they see things. These are ranging from academics who work on these challenges from an educational perspective, but also from school teachers, and we're very blessed also to have a current sixth form student as well, who's very kindly and bravely decided to enter into the fray. So I very much hope that you will all be able to join us. Laurie, I see, has just sent the link via the chat. Again, please, you'll need to sign up in advance, but I hope you can all join us. And perhaps we can just end by thanking Beatriz for such a stimulating and interesting talk, either clapping or clapping with a cymbal. And we can do both, I guess. And without further ado, just again to say thank you to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And Beatriz, once again, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.